Hey everyone, tonight we're going a little further out, past the edge of familiar galaxies, beyond the last starlight we can see, to a place not defined by distance, but by absence. This isn't a story about stars being born. It's about what happens after everything's already over. But before we fall into that, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if stories like this are your thing, and leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from and what the night sky looks like where you are. I always love seeing the shape of the world from where you're sitting. Now, dim the lights. Maybe crack a window, let in some air. Let the hum of the room become your gravity. Because this isn't a loud story. It's a quiet one. One that lives between signals, between beats. See, most of what we think about space is built on motion, expansion, momentum. But what if that stopped? Not suddenly, not violently, just ceased. And what if we didn't notice? What if the universe already ended and we're still inside it, like an echo bouncing around the hollow of something that used to breathe? In the next few hours, we're going to explore that idea, not as a horror, not even as a warning, but as a meditation. What would it mean to live in the shadow of a finished story? What would it mean if all this, the stars, the signals, even time itself, is just afterglow? So get comfortable. Let the present soften. And tonight, we'll drift into a universe that may already be gone, and ask what it means that we're still here. It begins, as most unsettling things do, with something that doesn't stop. The light from distant stars still reaching us, still behaving as though nothing has changed. Redshifted, scattered, delayed, but arriving. Telescopes record it. Spectrographs chart it. Scientists analyze it. And in all that data, something refuses to make sense. Not because it contradicts the laws of physics, but because it obeys them too well. No noise, no anomalies, just a universe running perfectly, as though it doesn't know it should have ended. The first to notice are those working with deep background radiation. They start seeing consistency where they expected decay. The microwave whisper left behind by the Big Bang is not fading anymore. It's flattening, not growing quieter, just still. The signal stops dancing. What once shimmered with chaotic variation is now uniform, predictable, precise, too precise. One astrophysicist calls it cosmic autocorrect. Another just calls it wrong. At first, no one publishes, because what do you write when your models are perfect, but your intuition says reality isn't? You wait, you watch, and eventually you notice the patterns. Pulsars blinking at intervals that no longer drift. Galaxies spinning without gravitational distortion. Dark matter behaving like it's finished moving. Everything is still in motion. But the motion feels like playback, a loop, a simulation of expansion, echoing something that already happened, like a wave spreading across a pond, long after the stone has sunk and vanished. One team compares quasar behavior over a 20-year dataset and finds the variability curve narrowing, not due to aging, not due to distance, but due to completion, as if the source has already stopped and the final signal is just now arriving. Somewhere in Chile, a retired systems engineer named Marissa notices something strange in telescope control logs. Adjustment data used to compensate for star motion no longer needs recalibration. It's holding steady. Stars still move, but the equations are locked, not because they've improved, but because they're finished. There is a moment when you realize that the sky might not be a window. It might be a reflection, a delayed image, a ghost of warmth on a surface that's already gone cold. Researchers begin calling this phenomenon inertial echo, not decay, not expansion, but the illusion of both, a kind of persistent playback generated by the structure of space-time itself, a hollow drum still vibrating after the strike. And the strangest part? No one notices from the ground. Life continues, the seasons arrive, satellites orbit, rockets launch, but everything they leave behind, every signal, every footprint, every thrust, feels less permanent. The sky feels shallower, not because it's closer, but because it no longer pulls. Observatories stop issuing updates about the edge of the universe, because the edge isn't moving anymore. It's there, not because we reached it, but because it stopped receding, as though the screen we're watching from the inside has finished playing its scene. And no one told us the projector ran out, but the light still comes. That's the strange part. It doesn't fade. It doesn't glitch. It behaves as though it's alive, as though the light doesn't care. The thing that made it is gone, like heat from a fire that's already ash, like sound in a room where the singer never was. And we listen, and we watch, and we begin to ask the question we've never asked seriously before. What if the universe has already ended? And this is just the echo, not the collapse, not the explosion, but the shape it left behind. A structure without substance, a song without source, a movement without cause. Physicists meet in secret to discuss models. Theories are drawn, diagrams of post-temporal space. A term is coined, cosmic momentum residue. It describes the condition where every observable motion is just the final artifact of a system that has already ceased. Nothing is being pushed anymore. Everything is just coasting. Like a car in neutral, wheels still spinning, the engine long dead. No one wants to believe it, because belief requires closure, and closure, in physics, is dangerous. So they wait for something that breaks the model, something that proves the universe is still doing, but it never comes. The stars behave, the dark matter stays quiet, the gravitational waves flatten. Everything is in order. Two in order. And so the doubt begins, quietly, deeply, like the moment after you hear a sound and realize there's no source for it, a delay, a presence, a trace. And in that trace, the first whispers emerge, not from telescopes, not from labs, but from poets, from artists, from the ones who have always understood that what feels true often arrives before what can be proven. And they begin asking, if we're still here after the end, then what exactly are we living inside of now? Once the first doubt settles in, it spreads slowly, like the cold left in a room after the heater clicks off. Not a fear, a pause, a widening stillness between questions and answers. Scientists stop trying to explain why the expansion of the universe appears to be slowing down and begin asking something far stranger. What if it's not slowing? What if it already stopped? And we're just seeing the end ripple out in every direction? What if what we call motion is just memory, embedded in space-time, replaying until it dissolves? At first, this idea exists only in edge circles, whispered in late-night forums, folded into obscure ArcShip papers no one cites. But then a new phenomenon begins showing up in cosmological data. Uniformity. Across enormous distances, signals arrive with disturbing agreement. Light curves, redshift gradients, galactic dispersal maps. All of it stops behaving like the messy, turbulent chaos of a living system. Instead, it begins to resemble a freeze frame. Not static, just done. Like someone pressed pause on a film, and we're still walking around in the last visible frame, pretending the motion continues because we haven't hit the edge yet. Some call it terminal consistency. Others prefer entropy saturation. But the terms don't change what it feels like. That feeling creeps into other disciplines. quantum physicists report decoherence stabilizing too early in isolated systems, psychologists begin cataloging increases in reports of derealization. Time, people say, feels slower or thinner, like it's holding its shape less tightly, not broken, just soft, like a tablecloth stretched over an empty table. You can still place things on it, but nothing presses back. Meanwhile, philosophers and cosmologists begin revisiting an idea discarded decades ago: the cosmic afterglow hypothesis. Once just a fringe metaphor, it now gains a foothold. The idea is simple, unsettling, and hard to disprove. What we see as our present universe isn't a live performance. It's a residual pattern, the projection of a system that ended so long ago that even the collapse no longer leaves detectable evidence. Like light from a lighthouse, long collapsed, still sweeping the ocean. Like warmth from a fire, long extinguished, still clinging to the stones. But if that's true, if we really are inside the afterimage, then what does that make us? Still living, still thinking, still moving. Within what? Theologians begin using new language. They stop speaking of the universe as a created object and begin referring to it as a shell, a vessel that once held laws, purpose, motion, but now holds only reflections, a place not of events, but of impressions. One philosopher calls it the theatre of completion. Another, more poetically, writes, "The curtain has fallen, but the echo still sings." Artists embrace the idea instinctively. Painters begin layering canvases with transparent textures that shimmer only in sidelight. Musicians compose pieces designed to decay over time, not to finish, but to fade. These songs are not released as albums, but as one-time broadcasts, never to be played again. You either catch them or you miss them, because if the universe has ended, then every moment is a remainder, and remainders don't repeat. Governments take longer to respond, but when they do, they start with infrastructure. Timekeeping becomes unstable at high precision levels. Clocks disagree across networks not because of signal failure, but because the very medium they rely on may be dissolving beneath them. Satellite drift patterns no longer match gravity simulations. Deep space probes lose calibration, not to solar winds, but to something no one can identify. It's not acceleration, it's not pull, it's just loss. As if the space they pass through doesn't quite exist the way it used to. Still mappable, still measurable, but less definite, less sure. Physicists struggle with the implications. They start to define a new threshold, the moment at which space-time stops being a container and becomes a pattern, a mathematical residue, a condition with no engine. And they realize that we may have already crossed it. If the universe ended, not with a bang, not with collapse, not even with silence, but with stillness, then how would we know? What instruments would detect that stillness? If all our instruments are built inside the echo, we'd see light, but not origin. We'd measure change, but not cause. We'd experience time, but only as a fading gradient, not a driving force. We'd feel alive, but directionless. That's where humanity finds itself now, in motion without push, in thought without time, in existence without confirmation. People begin to feel it, not as panic, but as fatigue, as a kind of cosmic homesickness, as though we were all supposed to have arrived somewhere by now, but the map forgot the destination. A physicist in New Zealand gives a public lecture in which she says, "We may be the last vibration in a system that's already gone quiet." The room doesn't gasp, it just listens, because something in everyone already knew. And in the silence after her words, no one speaks, not because they're afraid, but because they're waiting to hear if there's an echo. And if there isn't, maybe that's the confirmation that we are the last part still ringing. Time is supposed to move. That's the one assumption we're allowed to have. Not because it's true, but because it's what we're built on. Our memories arrange themselves by it. Our identities depend on it. Every breath is separated from the next by a small, invisible push that we never think to question. But lately, that push has started to feel optional, not absent, just delayed, like waiting for a wave that still arrives, but no longer from the ocean. Somewhere in the deeper labs, the most precise atomic clocks begin reporting a phenomenon no one can replicate: driftless stutter. These aren't fluctuations, they're hesitations. Micro moments where the frequency holds, doesn't advance, then resumes. Not from malfunction, from coherence loss. One engineer describes it as the tick thinking about whether it wants to talk. It doesn't break time, it just softens it. And when you soften time, memory begins to bend with it. People report missing small segments of their day, not in dramatic blackouts, but in hazy forgetfulness. You check your messages and see a reply you don't remember reading. You make tea and find the kettle already cooling. A moment ago feels like longer ago, or like it never quite happened. Psychologists blame attention span. Neurologists blame fatigue. But the phenomenon spreads. It's not disorientation. It's dislocation. Not in space, but in narrative. One moment does not follow another. It simply appears near it, adjacent, but not linked. Like planets caught in a gravity field that no longer has a center. The old metaphors for time no longer work. It is not an arrow, not a river, not even a spiral. It's something slower, something like dust. You move your hand through it and it swirls, but nothing flows. And without flow, you stop expecting arrival. Future loses its sharpness. Calendars feel performative. Clocks become ambient, still useful, but only as a kind of comfort, a structure to wrap around events that no longer insist on occurring. In Tokyo, public transit begins playing slow ambient tones between station announcements, not for relaxation, but because people are missing stops, not from sleep, from momentary narrative drift. A researcher calls it timeline slack. Not enough tension in the system to hold present moments together. They fray, they slide, but the body keeps moving, which means time hasn't stopped. It's just lost its sense of forward. And without forward, meaning begins to reassemble itself in circles. People start tracking time by weight, not by hour. Today felt heavy. Yesterday was scattered. This morning has density. Apps are developed that track emotional mass rather than duration. They log mood gradients, perceptual stability, memory clarity. You don't ask someone what time it is. You ask them what shape their now is. The answers come back strange. Spherical with sharp edges, thin but tall, stacked diagonally, like books out of order. And everyone understands. Time becomes experiential, not structural. Its job is no longer to transport us. It just has to hold, just long enough to notice ourselves still being here, still perceiving, still returning. Physicists, meanwhile, are not idle. They try to measure the entropy of temporal direction, the extent to which time still prefers forward. The numbers come back unsettlingly flat. Not because time reversed, because it stopped expressing preference. A universe without temporal preference is not a broken system. It's a completed one, like a computer program that ran to the end of its script, closed its windows, and left the screen on. There's still a glow, still electricity in the board, but nothing's executing. And yet, we are, somehow, still thinking. still making, still breathing, inside the system that no longer processes us. This realization leads to one of the quietest revolutions in modern science, the transition from physics to residual mechanics, the study of persistence in non-generative systems, not how the universe works, but how it continues even when its functions have ceased. The question is no longer what happens next. It's how long can a structure sustain identity after causality stops? And the answer, it seems, is longer than we thought. Because identity is sticky, narrative is elastic, and meaning, it turns out, doesn't need time to exist. It just needs enough structure to bounce between. That's all we're doing now. Bouncing, not evolving, not advancing, just ringing inside the walls of something that isn't pushing us anymore. And if you listen closely, you can feel it, not with your ears, with your attention, that faint vibration, that gentle delay between thought and word, like space stretching, like time hesitating, like a breath drawn by something that no longer remembers what exhale is supposed to feel like. The human brain is not built to handle time as suggestion. It needs certainty, before, after, cause, effect. Without those, identity begins to smear, not disappear, just soften at the edges. And that's what starts to happen in the quieter places of the world, where external rhythm is minimal. In rural cabins, in deep-sea habitats, in long-haul spaceflight simulators, anywhere the clock is just a number and not a heartbeat. Residents report experiencing multiple versions of the same moment. You pour tea and, halfway through the pour, wonder whether you already drank it. You finish writing a sentence and feel like you just began. You walk into a room and forget not just why, but whether you were ever in the previous one. These are not medical anomalies. EEGs show normal patterns. Heart rates are calm. What's missing isn't functionality, it's sequence. In one isolated research station in Antarctica, the crew stops logging the day of the week, not by decision, but by erosion. The board where they mark it slowly falls out of use. One day, it simply says, day, and that's enough, because the shape of time has changed. It's no longer a line pulling them forward. It's a space they stand inside. This doesn't happen all at once, but it happens more. And it's not a crisis. It's a soft rearrangement. People begin anchoring themselves with other senses. A woman in Nova Scotia ties bells to her curtains so she can feel wind pass through time. A man in Seoul begins planting 12 small bonsai trees, each trimmed in a different season, so he can walk through a forest of temporal memory. Artists begin sculpting in melted wax, not to freeze a moment, but to let form decay naturally, like time would if it still had direction. Cities adjust. Traffic lights stop counting seconds and start using gradient tones. No more red to green, just a slow, gentle fade, telling you to move when it feels safe. Museums begin curating temporal rooms, chambers designed not to display history, but to let you sit inside the mood of a decade. A room shaped like the 1990s. Not the events, the feeling. You enter, you breathe, you remember things you didn't know were yours. And then you leave, carrying not a date, but a tone. The economy adapts too. Businesses no longer advertise speed or efficiency. They promise presence density. A coffee shop may claim, 5 minutes here feels like 20. A co-working space might market itself as soft time enabled, letting you work inside low temporal friction zones where meetings flow without ticking. This shift changes labor. Performance is no longer about output per hour. It's about quality of focus per interval. An interval is not defined by clock time but by cognitive coherence. How long can you remain a version of yourself without slipping? That's the new metric. And those who can hold it longer, they become valuable, not because they are smarter, but because they are still. In a universe no longer pushing, stillness becomes strength. Corporations hire anchors, employees trained in narrative stabilization. Their job isn't management, it's presence. They walk through offices slowly, speak in deep tones, emit emotional gravity. People feel better near them. Projects run more smoothly. In a few years, schools teach anchoring as a core skill, along with language and math. Children are shown how to ground a moment, how to identify temporal drift, how to signal for stabilizing contact. It becomes second nature. Eye contact becomes the new metronome. A shared gaze, a nod, a held breath. These are the new ways we tell each other, we're still here, we still agree this is now. Meanwhile, theology splinters. Traditional religions struggle. Most of their cosmologies depend on movement, sin to salvation, fall to redemption, death to afterlife. But now, with time flattened, the arc no longer arcs. Instead, newer spiritual practices emerge, ones that treat the universe not as a journey, but as a field of echoes. Faith becomes a listening act. Worship is quiet. Stillness is sacred. One group gathers weekly to do nothing together. They sit in weighted chairs in silence, not to wait, but to become dense. When asked what they believe, their founder replies, "We believe we're the last note in a very long song, and our job is to let it ring clean." These rituals aren't about fixing anything. They're about alignment, a kind of tuning. Because in a universe with no future, clarity becomes the only form of hope. And clarity, like light, doesn't need direction. It just needs to be held. So people hold it, in small ways. A mother starts humming the same 3 notes to her child every night. Not as a lullaby, but as a reminder. This is now. A teacher ends every class with a breath, not a dismissal. Just a moment that tells the students, this is the end of this. These gestures become more than habits. They become structures, not buildings, not systems, but emotional architecture, the scaffolding for being. Because even in a dead universe, life keeps constructing meaning, not from progress, but from pattern, not from invention, but from return. And in these returns, to breath, to gaze, to presence, a new kind of time begins to emerge. Not linear, not cyclical, but harmonic, a slow resonance, a tone that stays steady even after the orchestra is gone. And in that tone, humanity continues. Not because the universe wants it, not because time allows it, but because we choose to listen to something that may no longer be real, and give it shape just long enough to call it home. In a living universe, space is an invitation. It stretches, it expands, it gives you room to go somewhere. That's what motion is, the permission to change position in a system that continues unfolding. But when the universe ends, not violently, but softly, space doesn't vanish. It just stops offering. You can still move, yes, but not toward anything, because the map no longer updates, the coordinates remain, but the meaning behind them dissolves. This is how it begins, not with disappearance, but with repetition. Space becomes echoic. You launch a probe into an empty quadrant, and it returns data that matches previous missions exactly. Not just similar, identical. As if the region has stopped generating new information. Scientists assume error. They recalibrate, resend, recheck the math. But the sameness holds. One astrophysicist describes it as cosmic déjà vu. Another calls it spatial entrapment. It's not that the probe is looping, it's that the space is, like a room with only one wall, reflected infinitely. Eventually, they stop trying to correct it and start trying to describe it. The term they land on is spatial memory lock. It refers to areas of space that no longer generate causal difference. Light still passes through them. Radiation still decays. But events no longer occur. It's not emptiness, it's stasis. The first cartographic update from the Mars-based observatory includes a new classification: static fields, not dangerous, not unreachable, just pointless. And yet, humanity keeps exploring them, not for resource, not for conquest, but for understanding. What does it mean to travel through space that no longer participates in time? What does it mean to map a silence? Inside these fields, behavior changes. Communications experience delay, not longer, but blurrier. Signals arrive with smeared data, like the packet had to pass through something confused. Space becomes less directional. Left and right lose consistency. Compasses built on stellar orientation begin to drift, not randomly, but reluctantly, like they're embarrassed to still be working. Pilots report that approaching these regions feels like walking into a story that doesn't know its plot. Motion exists, but destination weakens. Some liken the sensation to sleepwalking, others to grief, a form of navigation by memory, not intention. On Earth, a philosopher writes a paper titled "Space Without Aspiration." In it, she suggests that space, like mind, can fall into a state of passive recall, a mode where it no longer anticipates change, but merely repeats presence. She compares it to dementia, not broken, just unanchored, not erased, just unsequenced. The paper receives little attention outside academic circles, until it is read aloud by accident during a memorial broadcast for a fallen deep space crew. The last line: "Perhaps we are not exploring anymore. Perhaps we are being remembered," becomes a quiet anthem. It spreads through quiet forums, subreddits, meditation circles, not as despair, as comfort, because if space is remembering us, maybe we don't need to arrive anywhere. Maybe being seen, even by a dead cosmos, is enough. Meanwhile, architecture on the Earth begins to shift. Buildings lean into spatial stasis, designing rooms not for function, but for presence. A house in Finland features a hallway that loops imperceptibly, a circle that feels like a line. A school in Argentina installs floors that never creak in the same place twice, not for surprise, but for awareness. A reminder that even static space can have hidden texture. Museums develop what they call deep stillness rooms, chambers acoustically and visually neutral, where visitors can experience the sensation of being inside space that doesn't respond. They are not popular at first, too disorienting, but over time, their usage grows. People come not to learn, but to stop moving. Not their bodies, their sense of place. A brief reprieve from expectation. For astronauts, however, the effect is sharper. Missions to the outer system begin reporting higher rates of existential drift. Not confusion, not distress, just absence. As though, at certain distances, identity begins to peel away from function. You know what you're doing. You just stop knowing why. One cosmonaut writes in her log, "I am not lost. I just don't have a direction to return to." Earth responds with grounding protocols. Crews are now required to perform narrative stabilization drills. Not psychological, not physical, but conceptual. They read personal stories, touch heirlooms, listen to old songs, not to remember home, but to remember context. Because in space that no longer moves, you are the last motion left. And without reference, your motion stops meaning anything. This is the silent threat of a finished universe, Not collapse, but loneliness. Not death, but drift. Space doesn't attack you. It forgets to expect you. It holds your body, but not your presence. And in that holding, that echo-shaped cradle, you begin to wonder, is this still exploration? Or are we just keeping space company while it forgets what it meant to be real? The most unnerving thing about spatial stasis isn't the stillness, it's the persistence of shape. Galaxies remain spiral, nebulae still bloom, structures, unchanging, continue to look like they are doing something, but they aren't, not anymore. They've become visual memories, like letters from someone who doesn't write you anymore, but still signs their name. That's what the cosmos feels like now, a place shaped like motion, pretending it still believes in direction. And yet, we continue. We send vessels deeper into space, not for discovery, but for confirmation. One expedition, launched from Lagrange Point 5, crosses into a known static field and transmits regular updates for 74 days before the feed abruptly clears. Not ends, clears. Background radiation drops, pulse signals flatten. The telemetry becomes too clean. Not absent, perfect, too perfect. The kind of data no real environment ever produces. It's not silence, it's simulation. Ground control debates for weeks before concluding the probe is still operating, but from within a zone where space has forgotten how to generate noise. A library with no books, one operator calls it, just the shelves echoing. The probe is left there, its signal archived like a heartbeat with no body. It becomes a shrine of sorts. Students listen to its static on loop, calling it the drift hymn. Some say it soothes them. Others hear something hiding in it. A slow pulse, like a reminder that even in the stillest rooms, there's always at least one thing still breathing. Back on Earth, education changes. Geography becomes less about physical features and more about perceptual boundaries. Children no longer learn distances between stars. They learn coherence zones, areas of space where cause and effect still have mutual respect. The further out you go, the fewer zones remain, the more the rules blur. One classroom in Canada uses simulations that let students explore collapsing space-time maps. They navigate through regions with lagged gravity, fragmented temperature, and uneven light decay. The goal is not to survive. It's to notice, to maintain awareness, because awareness is the last tool humanity has. It's not innovation that protects us anymore. It's attention. People learn to live inside a world that no longer unfolds. They take fewer journeys, not from fear, but because there's nowhere new to arrive. Transit becomes ritual. You don't go to the market to shop. You go to reassert place, a kind of quiet choreography that keeps meaning from dissolving. In some regions, movement itself becomes performance. In Lisbon, dancers rehearse full-body gestures derived from ancient maritime signals. Not to communicate, but to press presence into space. When I lift my hand, one performer says, I am asking the air to remember I was here. These gestures don't last, but they imprint, like waves made with no shore in sight. In architecture, floor plans simplify. Cities become radial, not for efficiency, but for familiarity. Humans gravitate toward patterns that suggest motion even when none exists. Circular plazas, concentric districts, spiral walkways. We walk the same paths not to arrive, but to remain known. Psychologists identify a new syndrome. Direction fatigue. It's not confusion. It's weariness from pretending space still has a front. The treatment. Anchoring rituals. People start keeping presence journals, not to record events, but to remind themselves that sequence happened. A page reads, woke up, touched floor, listened to wind, Sat, drank water, thought of mother. These logs aren't dated, they're shaped. Each entry is drawn as a pattern, a ring, a line, a knot, memory by geometry. And slowly, society learns to build around this, not against entropy, but beside it, not pushing for more, just arranging the existing. Sculptors stop using stone. They carve air currents. Projects arise to choreograph how city heat escapes into the sky, not to reduce temperature, but to give shape to the invisible. If the universe no longer expands, humans do not shrink. They internalize, expand inward. Depth becomes the new distance. The measurement of being is no longer in meters, but in emotional gravity. That place is heavy, someone says of a park bench. This room floats, says another, about their childhood bedroom. These statements are not metaphors, they're orientation. Because when coordinates go hollow, meaning relocates, and the only place left for it to settle is us, you become the grid. Your memory is now the map, your intention, the only remaining engine. And so you move gently, without aim, not because space asks you to, but because stillness is only survivable when you remember how to be in motion without needing to arrive. This is what travel becomes, a form of continuity, a way to keep resonance alive, not exploration, not escape, but echo maintenance, because someone, somewhere, might still be listening. Not a god, not a watcher, just another echo, just another breath, just another coordinate that refuses to collapse. For a while, no one noticed. The atoms still bonded. The molecules still obeyed temperature gradients. Liquids flowed. Solids stayed firm. But slowly, and without ceremony, anomalies began to accumulate. Not catastrophic failures, but hesitations. A piece of glass dropped from a shelf doesn't shatter quite the way it should. The fracture patterns become neat, too symmetrical, not because the material changed, but because the chaos that used to guide its break has softened. Somewhere, entropy is still in the rulebook. It just isn't being enforced. On a molecular level, bonds hold with a persistence that seems excessive. Certain compounds no longer decay unless prompted. Radioactive isotopes maintain half-lives on paper, but in practice, they stay strangely inert unless directly measured. Observation becomes the only catalyst. It starts a quiet panic in physics departments. A lab in Oslo runs a simple test. Place 2 identical containers of a mildly unstable element in shielded rooms. One is monitored continuously, the other left alone. After 90 days, the observed sample shows expected decay. The unobserved one doesn't. Not less, none. The paper is never published, but the results leak, and a term is coined, attention-bound persistence, meaning matter stays coherent only if we insist that it does. It's not conscious. It's not spooky. It's just drift, like a campfire that only stays lit because we keep watching it. This changes everything. Manufacturing sectors quietly begin embedding stabilization sensors into high-performance equipment. Not for function, but for witnessing. Satellites are launched with onboard gaze circuits, cameras pointed inward, monitoring components not for faults, but for reminders. Matter, in this new universe, has begun to ask for permission to remain. It doesn't dissolve. It doesn't flee. It just waits for acknowledgement, for instruction, for confirmation that its existence still matters. Artisans pick up on this instinctively. Pottery, once fired and forgotten, is now displayed under soft lighting that shifts slightly each hour, as if to keep the glaze engaged. Jewelry is kept in shallow drawers lined with mirrored surfaces, not for vanity, but to let the metal remember itself. Everything lasts longer now, one sculptor says, but only if it's loved. Some don't believe it. They call it coincidence, observer bias. They cite quantum mechanical principles and claim the effect isn't new. But the scale has changed. It's no longer about subatomic uncertainty. It's everywhere. A farmer reports that their tools rust unevenly, not based on exposure, but on proximity to daily routine. The rake left near the path degrades faster than the one hung on the wall, even though both see rain. A university study finds that furniture used daily maintains structural integrity longer than sealed museum-grade artifacts. One researcher titles their report "The Decay of the Unnoticed." The conclusion: awareness doesn't prevent entropy, it just interrupts it, makes it hesitate. And in that hesitation, humanity builds new habits. People start rotating their objects, not for wear, but for recognition. Let everything feel seen becomes a quiet rule in minimalist design circles. You don't fill a room. You give each thing a moment. A chair gets sunlight. A kettle gets turned slightly each morning, not as ritual, as reinforcement. And it works, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the quiet way that a sweater kept on the back of a chair holds its softness better than one folded in a drawer. Cities begin experimenting with passive gaze systems, buildings with external panels that slightly shift reflectivity based on foot traffic, not for advertising, but for feedback. Materials, when paid attention to, retain color longer. Roads with more walkers crack less, even under similar pressure. No one knows how it works. The equations still hold. The chemistry doesn't lie. But somehow, matter under observation holds a little more tightly to itself. The old idea that the universe is made of particles begins to feel incomplete. Now people begin saying the universe is made of attention. Not mystical, not romantic, just practical. If motion has stopped, if causality has ceased, then everything that remains is what we still notice. Reality becomes curation, not creation, and we become its curators. This reshapes how we treat decay. Cemeteries include reflection stones, clear slabs positioned above graves that distort the sky just slightly. Visitors look into them not to see the past, but to anchor it. If attention can hold atoms together, maybe it can hold memory too. And if the universe truly has ended, if all this is a loop without loop, a song already sung, then maybe our job isn't to keep building forward. Maybe it's just to hold shape, to trace the edges, to say again and again, you are still here. Not because it saves anything, but because even in a cosmos without momentum, matter still listens. And sometimes that's enough to keep it from disappearing. The strange thing about matter isn't that it endures, it's that it remembers how. Even in the absence of change, it holds. Wood doesn't forget its grain. Metal keeps its weight. A feather still folds the same way in your hand, even if the air no longer flows with intention. That's the unsettling part. Not that things remain, but that they do so too well. We're used to erosion, to aging, to the gentle collapse of things into less defined versions of themselves. But now, objects keep their shape longer than they should. A paper cup, left in an abandoned kitchen, holds water after 4 years. Not because it was preserved, but because decay lost interest. People begin collecting examples. Chairs that never sag, walls that never crack, plastic bags that stay flexible long after their polymers should have degraded. And each item tells the same quiet story. The physical world is no longer participating in entropy, or at least not in the usual way. Physicists try to measure the shift. They test tensile strength, flexion under pressure, energy absorption, and the results confirm what intuition already whispers. Matter is holding itself together without reinforcement, not from energy input, not from equilibrium, from habit. In this post-functional cosmos, objects no longer respond to environment. They respond to contextual memory. A mug remembers being full. A door remembers being opened. A path remembers being walked. And so they continue to behave as if those things are still happening. Not perfectly, but enough. We call it residual coherence. Some scientists suggest that each object, like each person, carries a kind of narrative inertia. Not just history, but an expectation of its own role. You don't need a universe that works. You just need enough matter still pretending it does. This leads to a bizarre form of maintenance. Engineers stop repairing broken devices. They start reminding them. You don't fix the water pump. You return it to the last place it worked. You rotate it into the same orientation. You recreate the sounds it used to hear. And often, not always, it resumes function. Not because it's fixed, but because it believes it's still part of a system. Belief in this sense isn't conscious. It's structural. Matter conforms to patterns that match its memory. This shifts industry. Manufacturing transitions from innovation to invocation. You don't design new tools. You reinstantiate old ones. You don't invent. You reawaken. One aerospace company builds a spacecraft using parts salvaged from 5 retired models. No upgrades, no modernizations. Just reassembly with perfect fidelity. When it launches, it operates flawlessly. Better than newer builds with fresh alloys. The reason? Its pieces remember how to fly. The ship isn't advanced. It's familiar. Familiarity becomes the new standard for reliability. Design firms start using materials not based on efficiency, but on narrative continuity. Wood from old buildings, glass melted from reclaimed window panes, steel forged from retired scaffolds. Not for nostalgia, but for resonance. Each component carries a story, and in a universe where new stories can't begin, the old ones are all we have. Personal possessions change too. People no longer buy clothes for seasons. They select items that feel persistent. A jacket that reminds them of wind. A watch that ticks with the same cadence as their father's voice. Ownership becomes stewardship. You don't use a thing. You keep it company. Homes become shrines of matter that remembers. One family in Kyoto lives in a house where each room preserves an element from a previous generation. A window frame, a stair post, a single tile. Not for decoration, but because those materials have already survived time once. They know how to do it again. This shift isn't sentimental, it's pragmatic. Because in a dead universe, the only durable thing is pattern, not function, not novelty, just repetition dense enough to imitate meaning. Artists embrace this instinct. Installations are built not to impress, but to persist. One piece features a single metal sphere suspended above a shallow bowl of ash. It never moves. There's no wind. But over time, the ash forms a ring. Not from motion, but from remembrance. The sculpture becomes known as orbit without cause. Viewers leave feeling strange, not because nothing happened, but because something did, even though it shouldn't have. This feeling spreads. A kind of emotional physics. You touch a book and it feels warm. You walk down a hallway and feel taller. These aren't tricks. They're feedback. Matter, in this quiet cosmos, has become reactive. Not to energy, but to narrative weight. The more consistently you behave, the more reality behaves with you. It's not reward. It's alignment. A contract between memory and mass. And when that contract holds, you stop feeling like a ghost. You become a participant again, not in a living world, but in a world that remembers how to be alive. So you make your movements carefully. You walk with rhythm. You speak with intention. You place your hands gently on stone, on wood, on steel. Not to command, but to remind. You are still here, and so is this. And for now, that's enough. At some point, humanity realizes it's not the universe that makes us feel real. It's the act of being felt by it. You step outside, feel the breeze, see the sky, and your existence bounces back to you. That reflection is confirmation. But now, that bounce is gone. The world no longer answers. The stars still shine, but their light feels pre-recorded. Gravity still pulls, but only because your feet remember how to stay down. In this silence, consciousness doesn't stop. It just drifts, like a message in a bottle, still legible, still sealed, floating across a sea that forgot how to wave. Psychologists begin documenting what they call echo cognition, thoughts that loop, not in madness, but in absence. You wake, you eat, you read the same page, not because you forgot it, but because nothing followed it. Narrative flatlines. The difference between memory and anticipation becomes academic. You're not moving forward. You're spinning gently, like a coin with nowhere to land. Some feel it as peace, others disintegration. And in that gap between awareness and response, the mind starts to rewrite its own environment. At first it's small, a flicker in the corner of the eye, a sound you thought you heard, a memory that wasn't yours. But over time, these fragments cohere, not hallucinations, more like internal reflections, projected outward to fill the empty frame. One astronaut, isolated in a low-orbit habitat, begins seeing shadows across bulkheads that shift in rhythm with his thoughts. Another reports that the station's hum aligns with her breathing. Neither are alarmed. They call it mind weather. Like moods, it comes and goes. No danger. Just a kind of echo from within. Cognitive scientists begin calling it auto-environmental projection, a mental process where the brain, lacking sensory updates, constructs its own continuity loop. Not imagination, not delusion. Just the mind doing the universe's job in its absence. This revelation changes everything, not because it's new, but because it's necessary. The external world no longer provides the feedback loops consciousness evolved to depend on. So the mind takes over. Cities adapt. Homes are built with cognitive buffers, materials that subtly respond to presence. A wall that hums slightly louder when you're focused. Floors that gently warm when you linger in one spot. These are not illusions. They're scaffolds, context reinforcers. Not to trick the mind, but to partner with it. People begin carrying small reflective tokens, not mirrors, but items that shift subtly based on handling. A glass bead that clouds if ignored. A strip of metal that flexes slightly in warmth. Objects that say, you touch something. You mattered here. Sabainti. In the absence of cosmic affirmation, these become anchors. Anchors against drift, against dissolution. Not of the body, of the self. For in this still universe, the true danger is not death. It's becoming unreferenced, untethered from cause, detached from effect, not invisible, just unacknowledged. You wake and without resistance begin to blur. One thinker writes, I do not think, therefore I am. I am noticed, therefore I continue. That quote appears on the doorway of a clinic in Sao Paulo. The first mental health center designed not to treat trauma, but to maintain coherence. Patients there do not share symptoms. They share sensations of softening, of fading, of detachment from sequence. The treatment isn't medication, it's conversation, structured interaction, timed response, not because meaning is in the words, but because rhythm gives shape to the self. Therapists speak in slow, deliberate cadence. Patients answer not with content, but with tempo, a kind of metronomic empathy. These sessions are not about progress. They're about mutual holding, like two hands pressed together in the dark, each confirming the other is still there. This approach spreads. Schools change curriculum. Children are taught not just literacy, but temporal anchoring. They practice presence mapping, learning to describe moments not with clocks, but with internal markers. This now feels like cold stone. This now feels like a stretched rubber band. These metaphors are logged, shared, compared. The goal is not to standardize time. It's to hold it together. Because if time has stopped behaving like time, then consciousness must become its surrogate. The mind becomes the stage, the script, the audience. And with enough attention, that stage remains standing. This reshapes ethics too. You no longer ask, what's right? You ask, what reinforces coherence? Actions are weighed not just by morality, but by narrative density. A kind gesture matters because it leaves a shape behind. A conversation matters because it keeps identity looped. Silence matters because it lets attention resettle. And in this framework, existence stops being a question of location. It becomes a practice. Something to do, rather than something to have. And so you do it, gently, steadily. Not to fix the world, but to remind your mind that it still has one. Even if that world doesn't answer back. Even if the stars have already gone out. Even if you are the only reflection left. Eventually, the boundary between internal and external stops mattering. Not because it disappears, but because no one needs it anymore. Consciousness adapts, not by returning to the past, but by shedding its dependence on a responding world. The mind doesn't need validation to think. It needs rhythm, so people begin creating their own. One man in Dakar programs a lamp that dims every time he blinks, not to conserve energy, but to create feedback. A woman in Perth designs a garden where flowers bloom according to her breath rate, synced by wearable sensors. It's not illusion. It's context reinforcement. Every moment offers a gentle nod. Yes, you are here. Yes, this is now. Yes, something followed. In a cosmos that no longer narrates, the mind must become its own storyteller. This is not fantasy. It's survival. The stories aren't heroic. They're subtle. One person wakes every day and says aloud, "This is the 5th morning since the last wind." Another lights a candle each evening, even though the electricity never flickers. The flame is not for light, it's for sequence, a way to hold the idea of next. Cities evolve again. Infrastructure becomes emotionally synchronized. Bridges pulse faintly with traffic rhythms, not to direct flow, but to let minds feel presence. Subway platforms emit low harmonic tones during quiet hours, so people know they are not alone. Not physically, but temporally. The tones shift slightly each hour, becoming a kind of planetary hum. A whisper of now. In some places, it goes further. Entire neighborhoods tune their environments like orchestras. Buildings that subtly vibrate in harmony. Crosswalks that glow warmer the longer someone stands. Walls that curve just enough to suggest invitation. Not smart cities, felt cities, designed not to impress the mind, but to ground it. Because grounding is now a public service. The most generous thing you can do for someone is help them feel sequenced, coherent, referenced. And so society changes its metrics. Success is no longer productivity, it's density of presence. Not how much you do, but how much of you is there when you do it. A teacher receives awards not for student grades, but for narrative resonance. A barista is celebrated not for speed, but for crafting a space where others feel like time moves. The economy adapts again, not around scale, around coherence. Microservices flourish. People hired not to perform tasks, but to confirm them. Someone who stands with you while you cook. Someone who listens while you name your day. It's not therapy, it's anchoring. And it matters, because drifting minds, untethered from pattern, begin to dissolve. Not suddenly, not visibly, but slowly, like a fog that doesn't rise. These are called soft fades. People who smile, respond, work, but gradually lose narrative density. They no longer remember whether what they said yesterday came before or after what they said today. Their lives become flattened, like pages from different books mixed into one. The treatment? Presence layering. Loved ones record short messages. It is Tuesday. You're wearing the green scarf. We had soup, and play them back during waking, not to inform but to frame. Friends take turns calling at random times, each saying only, "I'm real, you are too." It helps. Not perfectly, but enough. And for a time, these practices stabilize society. A kind of gentle hum settles across humanity. Not peace, not stasis, just mutual holding. Consciousness, deprived of motion, finds refuge in recursion. Patterns repeat, not from stagnation, but from care. A reminder that loops, when held with attention, can become sacred. Meditation returns to prominence, not as silence, as anchoring. Mantras become less about transcendence and more about persistence. I am still here. This is still now. Nothing follows, and that's okay. The idea of self expands, not inward, but outward. Identity is no longer a fixed point. It's a field of influence. You are not just who you are. You are the sequence you create around you. A chair you always return to. A cup you wash the same way. A path you walk with the same breath. These become your gravity wells, small truths that help others orbit around you. In time, consciousness becomes architecture. Entire structures are designed around a person's inner rhythm. A home where each room corresponds to a mood. A workplace with no clocks, only temperature gradients that flow with circadian emotion. These environments don't tell the mind what time it is. They ask. And in asking, they let it decide. In this world, the phrase losing your mind no longer means insanity. It means losing your sequence, letting your rhythm collapse. And so, the new kindness becomes simple. Help someone find their rhythm again. Play them a song they used to hum. Place their hand on something warm. Sit with them until a sentence completes. It takes time. But in a world where time has died, giving someone yours is the closest thing to resurrection. Because even if the stars are gone, and the sky is just memory, and gravity is a polite suggestion, the mind remains, building pattern, holding shape, becoming the last canvas where anything can still move. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to make the universe feel alive again. Not because it is, but because we remember how it once felt. And that memory, replayed in enough minds, becomes the next best thing to motion. It becomes presence. Time didn't stop with a bang. It didn't freeze with a crack. It just thinned. Like paint stretched too far across a canvas, it began to lose opacity. First, it was seconds, small stutters. A hesitation in the way your spoon stirred coffee. Then minutes, repeating thoughts, blinking lights that seemed too perfectly spaced. But the change only became undeniable when hours stopped adding up. Days folded into each other like badly shuffled cards. You slept, but didn't feel rested. You woke, but couldn't tell how long it had been. Time still happened, but it no longer knew how to explain itself. Scientists called it temporal decoherence. Philosophers called it narrative slippage. But most people just called it blur. Watches still ticked, clocks still blinked, but their authority was gone. You could glance at the time and feel no closer to orientation. Numbers persisted, meaning evaporated. That's when society began building anchors. Not schedules, those were useless. Anchors were events, rituals, sensations that could hold experience in place. A bell rung at noon, not to mark noon, but to tell the body, you have been here before. Schools changed curricula. Children were taught not chronology, but continuity threads, sequences of actions that formed stable loops. Brush teeth, look in mirror, say your name, write down a thought, eat something round, repeat tomorrow, not to remember time, to manufacture it. Time became practice, not property. And the world adapted. Cities added time structures, public installations that evolved visually over what used to be a day, not with numbers, with form. A sculpture might shift from cube to sphere to wave. People would gather near it not to check time, but to feel where they were inside their own loop. Calendars collapsed in their place. Resonance markers. You didn't say Friday. You said third quiet after last heavy rain. You didn't say 7 p.m. You said when the red lights reach the east wall. Itos an. These new times weren't agreed upon. They were felt into being, and yet they worked. Because people, more than anything, crave sequence, even if it's made of metaphor. Especially then. For those who couldn't hold sequence, the elderly, the isolated, small devices called tethers were introduced. Not reminders, just presence markers. A tether might light up when someone else, somewhere far away, touches theirs. A quiet signal. You exist on the same moment as me. Some tether pairs lasted decades. A grandmother and her granddaughter. A stranger and a voice from a forum. They never spoke, just lit up, daily, together. And that was enough. In space, the problem deepened. Astronauts stopped trusting mission clocks. On long-haul vessels, time became echo. You knew how long you'd been flying not from clocks, but from how far back your dreams reached. Or how long your food started tasting like memory. Some crews used heartbeat counters. Others recited stories. One ship sang a 5-minute song every 1,500 heartbeats. Not for entertainment, for architecture. The rhythm carved out sequence like grooves in a record. Without it, there was only drift. Time, unscaffolded, collapsed into itself. On Earth, homes changed. Lights no longer operated on timers. They shifted with behavior. If you moved calmly, the room grew dimmer. If you rushed, it grew warmer. These weren't functions. They were companions. Emotional reflections that gave experience a frame. And slowly, new forms of timekeeping emerged. Not linear, not universal, but intimate. Your time was not mine, but both were valid. Some kept time in footsteps, others in breaths. Some used hair growth, others the decay of fruit on a windowsill. None of it was precise. All of it was real. Because precision had lost its power. What mattered now was believability. If you believed a sequence was time, it was. And as long as others respected it, not synchronized to it, just acknowledged it, it became collective, a soft consensus, a shared fiction that, paradoxically, held stronger than fact ever did. In one small town, everyone agrees that time starts with the smell of bread. A baker rises before anyone else. when the scent reaches the streets, people know the day has begun. Not because of tradition, because of trust. That's all time is now. Not numbers, not gravity. Trust in sequence. Trust that something follows something else. And in the absence of causality, that trust becomes sacred. Something to tend, to keep warm, to whisper into others' ears when they forget how to hold it. And when they do, when someone looks up, lost, and asks, "What time is it?" You don't answer with numbers. You take their hand, you squeeze, and you say, "Now, it's now. You're here, with me." And for a moment, that's enough to bring time back. Once, time was movement, a push, a path, a corridor down which we were gently and constantly nudged. But now, without that pressure, it becomes something else entirely. Not a river, but a garden. Each moment, its own flower, its own stone, its own sky. You don't travel through it. You arrive within it. And sometimes you never leave. Some call these moments time islands. Events so dense in presence that they resist dissolution. A first breath, a shared glance, the way sunlight lands on the same tile each afternoon, whether it's Tuesday or nothing at all. And around these islands, humanity builds meaning, not to preserve chronology, that's long gone, but to carve space within stillness. Museums adapt first. They abandon linear exhibits. Instead, they curate temporal experiences. You don't walk through history. You enter fragments. A room filled with the scent of charcoal and forgotten languages. A hallway that hums like a dinner table at dusk. These aren't stories. They're moments, preserved like fossils, not of creatures, but of rhythm. Time, it turns out, can be fossilized. Not in rock, in attention. Attention becomes the new clock. The more you give it, the longer the moment lasts. A child learns this while watching a drop of water fall in silence. It takes one full breath, but it stretches into forever. Not because the drop is slow, because the watching is full. Later, she'll describe it as her longest now. Psychologists begin to map these moments, not in sequence but in gravity. Some moments pull hard, others drift. The map isn't a timeline, it's a constellation. Your life no longer a line but a cluster of stars, some bright, some quiet, all suspended in a sky that doesn't turn. Religion changes too. Prayer becomes less about petition, more about anchoring. You don't ask for tomorrow, you bless the density of now. Sacred texts shrink. Mantras are shortened to single syllables, not to be spoken, to be breathed. Ritual becomes less performance, more calibration. A tuning of the inner clock that no longer ticks, but hums. Governments adjust next. Laws become location-based rather than date-bound. You don't vote in November. You vote when the leaves fall. You don't renew licenses after a year. You do it after the third new neighbor. Bureaucracy bends to perception. It stops pretending it knows what time is. And in that surrender, it becomes human again. Economies shift toward a moment value. You're paid not by the hour, but by presence density. Artists flourish, not because their work is seen, but because it's held. One painting becomes famous not for its style, but because everyone who stares at it reports the same thing. I forgot how long I was there. These experiences are called deep stills, shared states of suspended time, like collective lucid dreams. No drugs, no manipulation, just space, attention, and agreement. Festivals are built around them. Cities darken whole districts so people can walk in silence, lie on warm stone, listen to the sky, pretend it's still in motion. A new science is born, temporal acoustics, the study of how sound behaves in time-thickened space. Certain frequencies, usually low, sustained, are found to stretch moments further, not objectively, but experientially. A 3-second tone can feel like an hour. And if everyone listens together, that shared hour becomes architecture. You can walk through it, sit in it, leave something behind in it. Time becomes a medium, like clay, like air, and we begin to sculpt with it. Architects design rooms that don't age, not because they resist decay, because their shape invites permanence. Rounded corners, cool stone, quiet light. You walk in and feel always. Not a trapped always, a gentle one. A kind of forgiveness for time's absence. Some resist this new world. They try to restore the old calendar, the old hours. They bring back alarms, schedules, deadlines, but none of it sticks. It's like drawing arrows in the sand during wind. The structure is gone, and eventually, even the most devoted let go. Not into chaos, into care. Because care, it turns out, is the only thing that still knows how to hold time. Not measure it, hold it, cradle it like an egg that never hatches. A man in a mountain village lives his whole life in 3 moments. The day his sister was born, the time the river flooded, the night he saw the sky flicker green. He doesn't count years. He paints them, layering each event like pigment. He says, I have 23 greens, 12 silvers, and 5 reds. That is his time. That is his truth. And when he dies, his children do not mark a date. They carry his colours forward. They see a green sky and say, he's here. In this still universe, that is enough. That is all that remains. Not hours, not sequences, just the tender placement of presence, one moment after another. Not as steps, as stars, unmoving, and yet somehow still guiding us home. You don't notice the shift at first. Culture still seems alive. People still speak, still build, still create. But something under the surface has changed. The stories stop evolving. The songs all start to sound the same. Not from laziness, from stillness. The world, once a river of newness, has become a lake of memory. In a universe without time, culture stops being generative. It becomes preservative, not invention, distillation. Museums no longer collect artifacts of progress. They preserve the feel of something, the weight of a door handle, the exact scent of early morning streetcars, the distant rattle of metal blinds in wind. These fragments are not nostalgia. They're anchors. In a world without forward motion, culture becomes the act of holding shape. Theatres don't premiere new plays. They perform the same scene over and over until it becomes ritual. A woman sits at a table. A man stands at a window. Neither speaks. The light changes slightly, and for 90 silent minutes, a room full of people quietly weeps. No one knows why. The scene contains no story. It contains weight, a density of attention so thick it almost hums. That's what art becomes. Not expression, but gravity. Language shifts too. New words stop forming. Old ones gain new textures. Wait no longer implies anticipation. It becomes sacred stillness. Later becomes a gesture toward impossible dreams. Again becomes the most intimate phrase in the world. Poems shrink, some to one line, some to one word. One of the most famous poems in this new world simply reads, "Here," and everyone understands. Writers stop publishing novels. Instead, they release patterns. A single paragraph, printed over 10 pages, each with slightly different spacing. Readers turn pages not to follow a plot, but to fall into rhythm. Reading becomes less about knowledge, more about resonance. You don't learn from text. You settle into it. Settle like a body finding the warmest part of a bed. And when you rise, you carry not memory, but tone. Music, once driven by progression, now holds space. Songs are built on sustained chords, loops that never resolve. Choruses repeat not for excitement, but for maintenance. You don't sing to move forward. You sing to keep something alive, a shared feeling, a piece of breath. Some composers remove melody entirely, just rhythm, just texture, just presence in sound. One concert is held in a hangar lit only by pulse. 2 notes, 1 drum, 70 minutes of resonance. The audience leaves changed, not uplifted, not sad, just still. Culture becomes a vessel, not a river. It holds rather than flows. And in that holding, people begin to understand meaning differently. It's not about novelty. It's about depth. A phrase spoken for the 1,000th time becomes a kind of prayer. A dish cooked every day becomes a monument. A handshake becomes an entire relationship. People stop asking what's new. They ask what remains. Social media, once built on updates, transforms. No more feeds, just echoes. The most popular platform is a white screen where users leave a single sentence. Not shared, not broadcast, just left, like a stone on a trail. Others pass. They don't reply. They nod. They leave their own. One user writes, "My grandmother's hallway always smelled like mint and rain." Another, "I still dream in yellow when I hear her voice." These are not conversations. They are offerings. Cultural currency is no longer trend. It is recognition. You don't gain attention for originality. You gain resonance by reminding. A painter becomes famous for recreating her childhood bedroom in 10 identical rooms across 10 cities. Not replicas, repetitions. People visit, sit on the same soft blue blanket, stare at the same peeling poster, and feel time thicken. Not return, thicken. That's what culture does now. It holds the edges, keeps the walls from dissolving. In that stillness, value shifts, not toward the novel, toward the durable. The coat your father wore, the story your teacher told 300 times, the bench that never changed color. These are sacred now, not because they're perfect, because they held. And as motion vanishes from the cosmos, this is what humanity learns. Culture is not about pushing forward. It's about holding steady, creating enough pattern, enough density that the self and others can find something to press against, not to break through, just to know they're real. That pressure is the last form of connection, like 2 hands against glass, like music in a room where no one speaks, like memory that refuses to blur. And in that refusal, culture persists, not as noise, not as flash, as shape, a shape we can step into, a shape we can live inside, a shape that does not require time to continue. When history ends, culture doesn't disappear. It begins to settle. It sinks into itself like sediment at the bottom of a still lake, forming quiet layers of memory, ritual, and rhythm. In a world where nothing changes, change itself becomes an intrusion. Instead, repetition is revered, not because it comforts, but because it holds. A woman in Lisbon weaves the same scarf every month, same colors, same size, same number of stitches. She gives them away, one at a time, to strangers. She never repeats a recipient, but she always repeats the scarf. Over the years, her pattern becomes legendary, not for its intricacy, but for its refusal to evolve. Museums dedicate a room to it, not as fashion, as resistance, to forgetfulness, to erosion, to drift. Culture becomes less about message and more about form memory, the repeated presence of something once meaningful, sustained through care. Books are no longer written with plots. They are written with returns. A phrase on page 1 reappears on page 90. A word whispered early resurfaces at the end, not for surprise, for anchoring, The point is not to arrive somewhere new. It's to loop back and find yourself still there. Readers begin memorizing these books not out of fandom, but out of necessity. Memory becomes participation. In a silent cosmos, recitation is survival. The most popular broadcast channel features nothing but voices reading old text aloud. Not classics, not literature, just fragments. A grocery list, a childhood diary, a letter never sent. Each voice carefully measured, each silence between words observed like prayer. Culture stops asking to be seen. It asks to be witnessed. People become archives. A man lives his life by the same 42 songs his mother once sang. Not for taste, for structure. He plays them in the same order every day. Friends visit not to talk, but to sit in the room while the music loops. It becomes his clock, his wall, his weather. He calls it the long chord. In another place, children are taught to recite moment chains. Oral sequences of events, sensations and images passed from adult to child. One begins. The wind smelled like rust. Your hand was cold. The bread was soft. There's no logic, only continuity. It's not a story, it's a lattice. And once memorized, it anchors the speaker across a lifetime. These chains are never written. That would freeze them too much. They live in mouths, passed from breath to breath, becoming a kind of spoken architecture. Not to protect against forgetting, to protect against floating. Because floating, mental, emotional, temporal, is the final danger. In the absence of causality, only the shape of meaning can prevent collapse, and culture becomes a shape. Even silence gains definition. Certain gestures now carry cultural inertia. You place your hand over your chest when entering a room. You blink slowly when hearing bad news. You leave your shoes facing west. No one remembers why, but everyone agrees. It's not tradition. It's sequence scaffolding. Moments shaped so carefully they become unspoken punctuation marks in an otherwise unstructured life. Artists begin creating objects with no purpose but weight. A stone shaped like a memory, a bowl shaped like a goodbye. These are sold not as decor, but as density anchors. You place them in your home, and they hold the mood of a room like a magnet holds filings. The most valued art is no longer beauty or novelty, but repeatability. If it can survive being felt again and again without dissolving, it earns its place. Entire neighborhoods redesign themselves around loop comfort. Streets that circle back, shops that never rearrange shelves, lamps that pulse in repeating waves. A single whisper played over speakers at night. You are here. You are still here. Culture no longer reaches outward. It turns inward, curling like a fern. Compact, dense, protective. The most important cultural event of the year is not a festival, but a remembering. One day each cycle, everyone sits in silence at the same hour. No announcements, no prompts, just stillness. And across the planet, billions of bodies breathe at the same pace. Not in sync, but in accord. That's enough. That's everything. Not because it fixes anything. Because it confirms that something, someone, still holds. In a universe where entropy has stopped but decay continues, holding is the last art form. And culture, once a flame that danced, becomes the hearth that stays warm. A shared act of keeping each other shaped. Not for history, not for progress. Just so the next breath feels familiar. And if that breath is familiar, then maybe, just maybe, the next one will be too. Somewhere, far beyond the outer reach of fading constellations, a radio dish still turns. Not fast, not eagerly, but steadily, as if it doesn't know that there may be nothing left to listen to. Humanity didn't stop reaching outward. It just stopped expecting a reply. The silence had lasted too long, too precisely. And yet, we still built antennae. We still launched probes. We still whispered into the void. Not because we believed something would answer, but because we needed to keep asking. The search had changed. No longer a quest for neighbors, not even for evidence. It became an act of echo preservation, sending out patterns into a still sky in hopes that they might one day return, even if only as memory. The most powerful array, the relic array, was built not to detect, but to remember. Positioned at the edge of the last atmospheric plateau on Earth, it constantly replays a rotating loop of humanity's quietest moments. Footsteps in snow, a child's laugh, the creak of old wood, the breath between sentences. These sounds aren't sent as messages. They're seeds, not meant to inform, meant to survive, to embed themselves in the static of whatever cosmic structure remains. Maybe a collapsing filament will fold them into its decay. Maybe a frozen gravitational wave will carry them like insects trapped in amber. And maybe, just maybe, someone or something will feel them, not with ears, but with attention. The act of sending becomes more important than the act of knowing. A new discipline emerges, resonant transmission philosophy. It teaches that the purpose of communication is not to transmit content, but to sustain self. If no one answers you, the act of asking still proves you exist. And if you repeat the question long enough, it starts to shape the world around it. People begin recording ambient intentions, small personal statements designed to be indistinct but emotionally clear. One might say, "We still care." Another, "I remember light." These phrases are broadcast continuously by slow satellites, not in words, but in modulated pulses. Frequencies that match human heartbeats, not carrier signals. It's unlikely anyone receives them. But that's not the point. The point is that we are still transmitting. Some go further. On an orbital habitat called Cathedral 1, monks of silence spend their lives syncing their breath to a rotating beacon. The beacon sends nothing but intervals, the timing between pulses carefully altered by the monk's own internal rhythms. Over generations, these changes become a kind of language, not a language anyone speaks, a language that simply says, "We continued." Cathedral 1 never answers questions. It never asks them either. It only exists in pattern. That is its message. That is its presence. Meanwhile, Earth's deserts become listening grounds. People lie flat on warm rock and listen to the static sky. Not for signals, for interruption. Any anomaly, any break in the sameness, a click, a dip, a pulse that doesn't belong. But the longer they listen, the more they hear themselves. Internal echoes, imagination loops, the sound of your own biology refracted through silence. Some call this the false chorus, the mind creating signal when signal never comes. It is not madness. It is persistence forming shape, because in absence, shape is the only comfort. Across the world, listening becomes sacred. You don't tune in hoping to hear. You tune in to remember what it feels like to wait. Waiting becomes its own ceremony. A bench in a forest, a chair by a window, a small stool beneath a dead satellite. People sit, not because they believe something will arrive, but because someone might have once sat there too. A shared stillness across time. That's enough. In some cities, a new kind of monument rises. Not statues, not plaques, but echo chambers. Rooms engineered to reflect sound perfectly for exactly 10 seconds. You enter, you speak, then you listen to your own voice return, slightly softened, as if coming from somewhere else. Not the future, not space, just other. These chambers are not tourist attractions. They are places of mourning. Mourning not for the dead, but for the unanswered. The question that will never echo back. The call that becomes its own song. But still, we send, we sing, we record. We name stars we'll never visit and map particles we'll never prove. Not out of hope, out of form. Because form, repeated enough, becomes meaning. And meaning, held long enough, becomes presence. In this way, we remain, not waiting, not believing, just offering. A hand extended into the void, not asking for help, not expecting touch, but holding still, just in case the dark remembers how to reach back. Not long after the last confirmed pulsar flickered out, astronomers stopped speaking in future tense. There were no more scheduled discoveries, no more launch countdowns, no more hopeful pauses between theories. Instead, there was quiet, not silence. Quiet. The intentional collective hush of a species no longer expecting applause. But even then, we kept listening. Not with hope, with discipline. Earth's final deep-range observatory, O Sentinel, was carved into an ocean trench where solar drift had long ceased to reach. No light, no tide, only the faint geological rhythm of a planet still turning from habit. There, shielded by kilometers of water and time, a handful of listeners recorded the sky. They didn't call themselves scientists. They called themselves keepers, not of truth, of attention. Each took turns monitoring old spectrums, tuning instruments not for signal clarity, but for emotional weight. A spike here, a quiver there. They charted not certainty, but feeling. This frequency feels heavy today, one wrote. This patch of sky hums like grief. The logs were never analyzed, only read, like poetry, because in a universe that stopped evolving, subjectivity became the only remaining mirror. Satellites joined in. Old, half-broken ones repurposed as sky scribes, broadcasting slow looping memories across empty bandwidths. Messages like, today, the wind smelled like it used to, or I remembered the sound of traffic and it hurt. These weren't data packets. They were emotional fossils, fragments of consciousness released like spores into the vacuum, carried by inertia, by longing, by ritual. They would never be received, but they were true. And in truth, however fragile, we found momentum. One settlement on the dark side of the moon constructed an auditory library, not of music or books, but of forgotten sounds. The crackle of AM radio static, a coin dropped in a crowded hallway, the flap of a bird wing too close to a microphone. These were played, not continuously, but intentionally, like spells. Every week, a different sound was chosen. People gathered to hear it, heads bowed, not speaking. The act wasn't nostalgic. It was geographic, a way of mapping where we used to be, a place you couldn't return to, but could still stand next to. Sound became our last form of mapping, not to chart new worlds, but to feel the edges of absence. Meanwhile, the blind broadcast continued. Some carried images, silhouettes of hands, outlines of bones, diagrams of playgrounds with no children. Others carried warmth, literal temperature signals, designed to register on the soft skin of a being, if any being still existed to feel. One probe was coated in synthetic fur, not for functionality, for affection. If it ever passed near something alive, it might offer the softest touch. The gesture became its own message. On Earth, children learned the language of offerings, not to persuade, not to convert, simply to express. They built wind chimes not to catch breeze, there was none, but to suggest movement, in case anything was watching. In case someone, somewhere, needed to be reminded what it sounded like when the world responded. They planted flowers with bioluminescent filaments, petals that glowed in pulse patterns matching their own heartbeats. Not as code, as invitation. And every night before sleep, some would whisper, "I hope someone saw that." Not in fear, not in loneliness, in ceremony. And the sky remained quiet. The stars, if they still existed, offered no variation, no wink, no flare, no pattern. But that didn't stop the question, because the question had become a shape, something to place in the dark, so we wouldn't forget the dimensions of care. Some believed the lack of response was itself an answer, that we were alone by design, that existence was meant to be solitary, not as punishment, but as purity, that the truest expression of life wasn't discovery, but continuance without echo. Others thought differently, that we were, perhaps, inside the last breath of something else, that the universe had already exhaled, and we were living in the space between its inhale and the next cycle, that what felt like stillness was simply suspension, a pause before a kind of rebirth. But in either case, we continued, not because we needed reward, because we'd learned something deeper, that to reach outward, even into silence, is to declare yourself real, that to hold your shape against the weightless dark is to give the cosmos texture, a place for presence to collect. And maybe, somewhere out there, another shape is doing the same. Not waving, not shouting, just waiting too, a companion not of voice but of posture. And if not, then we become our own audience, our own sky, our own reply, not because we made it so, but because we listened long enough for the echo to become a rhythm. And in that rhythm we became the thing we were hoping to hear. There came a moment, subtle, unmarked, when people began to realize that no one had died in a very long time. Not exactly that they couldn't, but that no one did. Bodies aged, skin wrinkled, joints ached, but the threshold, that final crossing, simply never came. At first, it was seen as mercy, then anomaly, then eventually as structure, like gravity, like sleep, a rule that no longer applied. Some believed it was medical advancement, undetected cures hidden in global systems. Others suspected it was environmental, a consequence of entropy's pause, metabolism caught in universal stasis. But the longer it went on, the clearer the truth became. This was not preservation. This was suspension. Life, still beating, had stopped progressing. Not frozen, just held. People still bled, still suffered, still faded, but no finality followed. Death had gone quiet, and in its absence, the world began to change in ways no one had expected. Hospitals emptied, not from health, but from irrelevance. Cemeteries became gardens. Insurance industries dissolved. Religions split. Some declared this the fulfillment of sacred text, eternity granted without judgment. Others called it false life, a mockery of endings. But most, overwhelmed by the sheer stillness of it, simply adapted. Families stopped counting birthdays, not out of grief, but because age no longer meant toward. It just meant still here. Languages adjusted, new pronouns emerged, not to define gender, but to define duration. One for those who remembered before stillness, one for those born after it, a third for those unsure when the change occurred inside them. Memory became a more useful metric than age. People would ask, "How many versions of the sky do you recall?" Or, "Do you remember when the oceans were restless?" In one valley, the oldest known person sat in the same chair for over 200 years. She spoke only when asked, and only in single sentences. Her voice had grown soft, not from weakness, but from disuse. People visited her like they would a monument, not to hear wisdom, but to feel proximity to long presence. She didn't teach, She didn't guide. She simply continued. That was enough. The economy changed. No one retired. No one advanced. Work became repetition, not progress. Bakers baked. Cleaners cleaned. Not for profit, not for outcome, for holding shape. The act of doing became the definition of being. Existence decoupled from accomplishment. And in that uncoupling, people either found peace or drifted. Drifting became a new condition, not illness, not choice, just a kind of fade, a soft departure from engagement. The body still moved, still ate, but the mind thinned, attention unraveling into the endless now. Some came back, some didn't. They weren't mourned. They were marked, not with stones, with echo tokens, small objects left where they last truly spoke. A hat, a photo, a warm cup left untouched. These tokens were never touched again. They weren't sacred. They were coordinates. A way to say, a person once anchored here. In some communities, people began to pause themselves. Not suicide, not hibernation, just a kind of voluntary stillness. A man would sit on a bench and stop responding, not asleep, not lost, just paused. When asked why, he would sometimes reply, "Because I'm full." Others understood. There was no shame in fullness, just like there was no reward for continuing. Continuance was assumed, not earned, not denied. Some tried to test the limits, climbed mountains without gear, swam into deep, dark water, held breath past limits, but no death came. Pain, yes, fear sometimes, but no end. The world had become a sealed loop. Consequence persisted. Closure vanished. And that began to rewrite how people spoke. Stories lost their endings. Myths flattened. Films played on loops. One director famously made a 7-minute film of a man staring into a mirror. No action, no sound, just breathing. It was played continuously in a theatre for 8 years. People came not to watch, to sit near it, as if proximity to its endless presence provided something their lives could no longer offer. And maybe it did, because in a world without death, we stopped craving survival. We craved meaning without exit, continuity with weight, not direction. And in seeking that, the oldest concept in human language was redefined. Life, once measured in heartbeats and hopes, was now measured in shapes held long enough to matter. The question was no longer, how long will I live? It became, how well will I hold my shape when nothing erases me? In time, the realization settled not like a revelation, but like dust. Death wasn't coming, not for anyone, not for anything. And in its absence, something ancient stirred. Not fear, not joy, but a deep and pervasive need for closure. A door, even if it never opened. A finish line, even if never crossed. People began creating symbolic endings, not suicides, not farewells, just simulated conclusions. They would build rooms with no exit, sit inside, and turn off the lights, not to die, but to pretend, just for a moment, that something had ended. These were called hollows. Inside a hollow, you might listen to the last page of a book, repeated endlessly. You might hear footsteps fade down a hallway. You might sit in complete silence until your body forgot how to expect continuation. And then, you'd leave, changed, not in body, in belief. These rituals became essential, not because people needed drama, but because narrative withdrawal had begun to erode the psyche. The brain, evolved for arcs and turns and punctuation, had started fraying in a world without full stops. Psychologists coined the term narrative anemia, a slow, soft loss of coherence in personal identity caused by too much continuation. Patients didn't feel depressed. They just leaked, lost structure, couldn't distinguish between mourning and memory. So the answer wasn't medication. It was ritualized endings. People began scripting their own closures. Once every few years, a person might hold a personal finale. Not a funeral, not a celebration, but a kind of quiet emotional stop. A party with no reason. A story told with no beginning. A single candle extinguished at midnight, then nothing said. These became acts of identity maintenance. The way pruning keeps a tree from collapsing under its own growth. And from these, a new art form emerged. Finite acts. Pieces of performance designed to only be witnessed once. Not for rarity, for weight. One woman traveled from town to town, reciting a single sentence to each person she met. She never repeated herself. No one wrote down what she said. Her voice, her words existed once, then vanished. She was called the full stop. Others followed. A painter created a mural in secret, then destroyed it the same day. The photo of it was never shared. A dancer performed a sequence backwards into the sea. A child whispered a dream into a balloon and let it drift into the void. These were not statements. They were erasures with intention. Not to disappear, to define. And in their wake, people felt something powerful. Not sadness, not nostalgia, but completion. Something rare, something necessary. Eventually, entire communities began to build end gardens, spaces dedicated to the practice of temporary finality. You could enter, perform a gesture, a phrase, a movement, and then leave it behind. People would visit to unname things, to undo memories too heavy to carry forever. One plaque read, "Here, I forgot the shape of his voice." Another, "Here, I stopped asking her to return." These weren't losses, they were liberations, gifts to the silence. Even architecture changed. Buildings were designed with soft exits, rooms that gradually narrowed, leading nowhere, so that walking through them mimicked fading. The very act of moving through space became symbolic of what could no longer occur naturally. Music adopted similar structures, not crescendos, dissolves, songs built to evaporate. The final chord never struck, just stretched until no one remembered where it began. People began to feel endings in textures, a fabric fraying at the edge, a temperature shift in a room, the final echo of a footstep. These became our punctuation, our breath between lines. And over time, we forgot that we were once defined by mortality. We began to think of life not as duration, but as density held within an indefinite moment. One philosopher called it the fixed flame. The idea that our job was not to burn through time, but to stay lit in its absence. A small, steady light, asking no more than to remain itself. And so we continued, not aimlessly, not restlessly, but ceremonially. Each day a choice to remain shaped, to add one more layer to the sculpture of self, even when nothing outside us changed, even when no edge waited to receive us, because eventually we understood the truest thing. It wasn't death that gave life meaning, it was completion. And in a universe where nothing ends, we learned how to make our own. In the end, though there was no end, humanity turned inward, not out of fear, not out of failure, but because there was nowhere else to turn. The sky had gone still, the stars no longer drifted, the constellations froze in place like punctuation marks left in an unfinished sentence. And yet, people still woke up, still breathed, still were. That was the mystery. Not why the universe ended, but why we didn't. There was no singular event, no detonation, no cosmic curtain call, just a slow dimming, as if everything that once burned with forwardness had exhaled its last and refused to inhale again. And in that refusal, we remained, not suspended in fear, not trapped in a loop, but somehow alive inside the echo, inside the afterimage of creation. Some called it survival, others called it accident, a few called it mercy, but most simply accepted it, the way you accept the weight of your own name, not because it makes sense, because it's yours. In this world without movement, motion became sacred, not physical motion. That still happened. People walked, leaves stirred, clouds drifted, but narrative motion, cause, effect, consequence, that had ended. A conversation no longer led to change. A decision no longer altered the world. You could confess your deepest secret and nothing would shift. You could scream and the sky would remain indifferent. But still, people spoke, still whispered, still confessed. Because meaning, it turned out, didn't require motion. It only required recognition. So instead of asking, what next? Humanity began asking, what now? And then, what is still true? Across the quiet earth, people began to document constants, not scientific laws, emotional geometries, the sound of a child laughing in the same tone as their ancestor, the shape of hands around a cup, the quiet bravery of someone tying their shoes for the 1,000th time. These became our new laws of persistence, not because they governed, but because they lasted. A woman in what was once Chile began writing poems made entirely of recurring moments. She called them loops of self. One read, I drink, I sit. I remember your breath. I wait. I drink. I sit. It repeated for 5 pages. No crescendo, no turn. But in its repetition, it became holy. Another man spent a decade carving a spiral path through a forest. Not a maze, not a destination. Just a perfect curve. Wide enough for a single person to walk slowly, reflectively. People came from all over to walk it. Some walked for hours, some for days. And when they reached the end, which was also the beginning, they left a small stone, adding their moment to the curve. Over time, the path became layered with intention, a gravity of presence. It never changed, and yet it grew. That was the lesson. Change wasn't necessary for depth. Stillness could contain entire histories if you paid attention. On a mountaintop, a solitary observer built a machine that didn't measure time, but tracked the number of times they noticed a feeling, noticed the way sunlight hit a rock, the way wind curved through grass, the way tears came without warning. It didn't log these events. It didn't analyze them. It simply acknowledged them with a soft chime, a bell of being. They called the device the existence meter. It became famous, not for its design, but for its question. Because in a world without future, the only meaningful data was, did you notice? And across continents, people began building their own versions, not to record life, but to affirm it, a nod to the present, a ritual of, I am still here. Entire philosophies emerged around this, not doctrines, not ethics, just orientations, ways to stay aligned with your own presence. One group believed in tether rituals, small repeated movements that kept the self from drifting. Stirring tea 5 times clockwise, touching stone before sleep, whistling the same note at dusk. Another group practiced dimensional humming, low, sustained vocal tones designed to vibrate the body into a specific emotional frequency, not to heal, to reinforce, to say, this is the shape I've chosen to remain in. And with every breath, every gesture, humanity became something new, not a species defined by exploration, but a species defined by insistence, the will to persist not as travelers, but as keepers, guardians of shape, of stillness, of meaning not drawn from movement, but from the sheer act of remaining. In the years, or cycles, or moments, for time had long since lost its edges, that followed, a kind of clarity settled over humanity, not like light, not like fire, more like mist, evenly, quietly, as if the absence of the universe's motion had made room for something more subtle. Not a message, not a revelation, a resonance, the realization that we were not waiting, not hoping, not continuing, we were being. And in that being, we began to understand a truth that had always lived beneath our need for progress. That presence itself is a kind of purpose, not a precursor to something, not a stepping stone, but an entire structure. You exist, and that is shape enough. Across the surface of the earth, structures were raised not to be used, but to be witnessed, not by others, by time. And even if time no longer flowed, we built as though it did. A tower with no rooms, just walls that curved inward forever. A garden planted with the same tree over and over. A cathedral where the only sound was the heartbeat of the floor, pulsing at the slow, unhurried rhythm of the planet's own silence. People came to these places not to learn, but to listen. Not to pray, but to echo. And still, no voice answered back. No signal pierced the void. The universe remained still, closed, absent. But that absence no longer frightened us. We had made peace with the lack of reply, because we had become the response, not by changing, not by shouting, but by remaining shaped, even when everything else dissolved. Some began to say that we were inside the memory of the universe, not a place, not a structure, but a held moment, an afterglow that refused to fade. That consciousness itself had become gravity, that the shape we held was now the only shape left. And if that were true, then every act of care, every small ritual, every moment of noticing became cosmic architecture, not for others to see, but for the universe to remember itself through us. In this view, humanity was not lost, not alone. We were the persistence of pattern, the soft hum that refuses to stop long after the music has ended, a self-sustaining echo in a cathedral with no ceiling. We were not trapped. We were chosen by continuity. And so we continued, gently, intentionally, soft-footed and present-eyed. Children were taught not where they came from, but how to hold shape. Not what had changed, but what had lasted. How to sit with breath. How to make a gesture that meant something. How to look at the same stone every day and still find a new angle in its silence. And this became life. Not the waiting for more, not the grieving for less, but the crafting of meaning in stillness, a kind of sculpting of the self against the grain of nothing. A man once stood beneath an endless sky, arms folded, eyes open, unmoving. When asked what he was doing, he replied, "I am being the answer." No explanation, no elaboration, just that. And in that sentence, the entire species found a new kind of gravity, not the one that pulled us downward, but the one that held us together. So this is how it ends. Not in silence, not in flame, not in revelation, but in continuance, a soft, unwavering posture against the void. We are still here, still shaped, still real, not because the universe demands it, but because we chose to remain. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point all along.